The wind howled through the towering pines, rain lashing against the wooden walls of the isolated house. Inside, Doña Catalina sat near the fireplace, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The crackling flames offered little comfort when the storm outside masked an even greater danger approaching in the darkness. A sudden bang shattered the tranquility. The front door burst open, sending a gust of wind and rain into the cozy home. Two masked men stormed in, their boots leaving muddy imprints on the wooden floor. Catalina gasped, clutching her chest as one of the intruders pointed a pistol at her. "Where is it?" the taller outlaw growled, his voice thick with menace. She didn't understand. Or maybe she did, but revealing anything could mean signing her own death warrant. Nearly 500 miles away, Carlos Ortiz was finishing his evening workout when his phone buzzed. The former Navy SEAL was a man of discipline, strength, and unwavering loyalty, especially to the woman who had raised him. He answered, and the news sent ice through his veins. His grandmother was in danger. Carlos didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was on his way back to San Felipe, a town he hadn't visited in years. But there was no time for nostalgia. The skills he had honed in combat zones would now be tested on home soil. What these criminals didn't know was that they had just crossed the wrong family. This is a story of courage, vengeance, and how far a man will go to protect those he loves. Subscribe now and follow the gripping journey of Carlos Ortiz, a Navy SEAL who won't stop until justice is served. The rural town of San Felipe lay quiet under the cloak of night, a place where time seemed to move slower, where the scent of fresh earth and burning wood filled the air. Life here was simple, honest. People looked out for one another, bound by years of shared struggles and small victories. At the far edge of town, past fields of tall grass and groves of oak trees, stood a modest yet sturdy house. It had been in the Ortiz family for generations, its wooden walls weathered but strong, much like its current resident, Doña Catalina. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, gazing out into the night with calm, observant eyes. Age had lined her face, but her spirit remained unshaken. The warm glow of a lantern flickered beside her, casting soft shadows on the walls, adorned with old photographs, memories of a life well lived. To San Felipe, she was more than just an elderly woman. She was wisdom, kindness, and resilience wrapped in one. A healer, a storyteller, a guardian of traditions. To Carlos, she was everything. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper of unease. Catalina's sharp instincts sensed it before she even saw them, figures moving in the distance, staying just beyond the reach of the moonlight, lurking, watching. She inhaled deeply, setting her teacup down with slow precision. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations she had overheard in town, rumors of outlaws, of men who took what they wanted without consequence. Her grip tightened around the armrest of her chair. A creak, not from the house, from outside. Her heart pounded steadily in her chest, but her hands remained steady as she reached for the drawer beside her. Inside, wrapped in a cloth, was an old revolver, her late husband's. She hadn't touched it in years, but tonight, it felt right. A shadow passed across the window, not the wind. They were closer now. Not far from the house, concealed by the trees, two men stood whispering. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted the mask over his face. His companion, wiry and restless, tapped the hilt of a knife against his palm. "She's alone," the taller man muttered. The other smirked. Easy job, then. For days they had watched, tracking her movements, learning her routines. Doña Catalina wasn't just another target. She was connected to a family that had caused trouble for men like them. Tonight, they had come to settle the score. A distant coyote howled, breaking the silence. Catalina's fingers curled around the revolver's grip. The lantern beside her flickered. Then she blew it out. Darkness swallowed the room. She was ready. The distant hum of an old truck echoed through the rugged countryside as El Toro lit a cigarette with slow, deliberate movements. The ember glowed against the sharp lines of his face, casting shadows under his deep-set eyes. He exhaled, watching the smoke swirl into the cool night air. San Felipe. It had been years since he last set foot in this place, yet the memories were as sharp as ever. Blood, betrayal, and a name he had never forgotten. Ortiz. A smirk played on his lips. He had waited long enough. Behind him, his men murmured in low voices, restless. "You sure about this?" one of them asked, shifting on his feet. El Toro turned his gaze toward the town. That old woman is the last thread of that family's honor. If we pull it, everything unravels. He flicked his cigarette into the dirt and stomped it out with his boot. Tonight would be a message, a warning, a reckoning. Hundreds of miles away, Carlos Ortiz wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at his phone. The gym was nearly empty, the sound of heavy bags being struck echoing through the dimly lit space. Carlos had always trained hard, but this session had been different, more intense, more calculated. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him discipline, had sharpened his instincts to an edge. Yet, in the silence that followed his last punch, a strange unease settled in his chest. The phone vibrated against the bench. Martin, San Felipe Police Department. Carlos, it's your grandmother. Something's happening. His breath caught. He snatched the phone, muscles tensing as he read the message again. His mind raced. Catalina. Without hesitation, he hit the call button. Martin answered almost immediately, his voice hushed. Carlos, listen to me. I don't have details yet, but there's trouble brewing. Strangers have been seen near your grandmother's house. Some say they're connected to El Toro. Carlos's jaw clenched at the name. I'm on my way, he said, already grabbing his keys. Carlos, wait. We don't know how bad this is yet. Let me... But the line had already gone dead. The roads leading to San Felipe were long and winding, cutting through dense forests and open fields. Carlos drove fast, his hands gripping the wheel, his mind replaying every lesson he had learned in combat. Assess, adapt, execute. But this wasn't a mission overseas. This was home. The last time he had seen El Toro, the man had been a younger, reckless brute with no regard for life. Carlos had hoped prison would be the end of him. Clearly he had been wrong. His mind flickered back to Catalina. Her warm smile, the way she would scold him for not eating enough when he visited. He pushed the accelerator harder. He wasn't too late. He couldn't be. Up ahead, the first dim lights of San Felipe appeared in the distance. The town was waiting, and so was the danger. The tires of Carlos's truck screeched against the dirt road as he pulled into San Felipe. The town was eerily quiet at this hour, its streets lit only by dim street lamps and the occasional glow from a window. But something felt off. He could sense it. His first stop was Martin. The local police officer had been his childhood friend, someone he could trust in a place where trust was a rare commodity. Carlos parked outside the small police station and killed the engine. The door creaked as he stepped inside. Martin sat at his desk, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. His face was lined with tension. You got here fast, Martin said, standing. Carlos didn't waste time. Tell me everything. Martin sighed, rubbing his forehead. There have been reports of men lurking near your grandmother's house. Strangers. No one's gotten a good look at them, but the few witnesses we have say they're not from around here. And there's one name that keeps coming up. El Toro. Carlos's fists clenched. I need to see her. Now. Martin nodded. I'll come with you. The dirt road leading to Doña Catalina's house was lined with gnarled trees, their branches swaying under the weight of the night wind. Carlos drove in silence, his mind focused, calculating. The second they arrived, he stepped out, scanning his surroundings. Something wasn't right. The wooden gate that led to the front porch was slightly ajar. His grandmother always locked it. His pulse quickened. Without a word, Carlos drew his knife and moved forward, his instincts kicking in like muscle memory. He pressed a hand against the door and pushed it open slowly. The house was dark, too dark. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The faint scent of chamomile tea still lingered in the air, but something else overpowered it. Gunpowder. Carlos moved cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then he saw it. A chair overturned, a shattered teacup, and a single bullet lodged into the wooden wall. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. She was gone. Martin stepped inside behind him, his breath hitching. Carlos! Carlos raised a hand, silencing him. He crouched, fingers tracing the broken pieces of porcelain on the floor. The impact pattern, the direction of the bullet hole. He was trained to read the signs, and the message was clear. It wasn't a robbery. It was a warning. A flicker of movement outside caught his eye. He was on his feet in an instant, rushing to the window. A figure disappeared into the tree line. Stay here, Carlos ordered. He didn't wait for Martin to argue. He moved quickly, silently, slipping into the night. The damp earth muted his footsteps as he followed the trail. His pulse steady, his breath controlled. Then he saw it. half hidden in the grass, a boot print, deep and fresh. Someone had been here, recently. A few yards ahead, a cigarette still smoldered in the dirt. The scent of cheap tobacco lingered in the air. They had taken Catalina. Carlos straightened, his jaw tight. But as his eyes scanned the surroundings, something glinted in the moonlight. A single shell casing. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. A mark was etched into the metal, a symbol he recognized from his past. El Toro's men. A slow, dangerous fire burned in his chest. He had a lead now, a clue. Carlos turned back toward the house, his mind already forming a plan. Whoever had taken Catalina had made a fatal mistake. They had left a trail, and Carlos was going to follow it. Carlos stood in the dimly lit living room of his grandmother's house, rolling the shell casing between his fingers. His mind was working fast, analyzing every possibility. Catalina had been taken, and the men responsible had left just enough evidence to lead him in the right direction. But now the real question was, how would he get her back? Martin paced near the door, his hands on his hips. Carlos, listen. We need to handle this carefully. If El Toro is involved, we can't just charge in blind. Carlos exhaled slowly. Martin wasn't wrong. His SEAL training had drilled one fundamental principle into his core: never rush into battle without a plan. His options were limited. He could wait for more information, try to gather intelligence before making a move. But every minute wasted put Catalina in more danger. Or he could act now, alone. Carlos turned to Martin. You know as well as I do that if we involve too many people, we risk tipping them off. I need to go in quietly. Martin shook his head. And if they're armed? If it's a trap? Carlos's gaze hardened. Then I adapt. The room fell into silence. The weight of the situation pressed down on both men, but for Carlos, hesitation wasn't an option. Martin sighed. All right, what's the plan? Carlos grabbed a map from a nearby drawer and laid it on the table. These men are smart, but they're not professionals. They left a trail, footprints leading east toward the abandoned ranches past the river. Martin nodded. That land used to belong to a cartel associate. No one's been out there in years. Exactly, Carlos said, which makes it the perfect place to hide someone. Martin hesitated before speaking. If you're right, you won't just be walking into a hideout, you'll be walking into an ambush. Carlos smirked. Carlos, then I better make sure I'm the one who surprises them. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant smoke as Carlos crouched near the outskirts of the abandoned ranch. The old structure loomed ahead, its walls cracked and worn, vines creeping up the sides like skeletal fingers. He had scouted the perimeter first, noting the positions of two guards, one near the entrance, another stationed on the rooftop with a rifle slung across his chest. Not cartel-level security, but still dangerous. Carlos moved like a shadow, pressing against the outer wall. He needed to neutralize the sentries without alerting the others. Fast, quiet, efficient. He reached for the throwing knife strapped to his thigh, adjusting his grip. His movements were second nature, his breathing steady. With a swift flick of his wrist, the blade cut through the air, embedding itself into the first guard's neck before he could make a sound. The second guard on the rooftop shifted, sensing something was off. But by the time he turned, Carlos was already scaling the wall, using the overgrown vines for leverage. One quick, precise move. He wrapped an arm around the guard's throat, cutting off his air supply until his body went limp. Carlos exhaled slowly, scanning the area below. The front door stood slightly ajar. They weren't expecting an attack. Perfect. He slipped inside, moving through the darkened hallways with careful precision. The building smelled of sweat, stale beer, and old wood. Muffled voices carried through the corridors. Then he heard it. A familiar voice. Catalina. Carlos pressed himself against the wall, listening. You think my grandson won't come for me? Catalina's voice was firm, fearless. You're bigger fools than I thought. A low chuckle followed. Oh, we're counting on him coming. Carlos's muscles tensed. They were expecting him. Good. They wouldn't be ready for what was coming next. Carlos remained motionless in the dark corridor, his breathing steady as he listened to the voices inside the room. Catalina's words were sharp, unwavering. She wasn't afraid. That was no surprise. But the response from the men holding her confirmed what he had already suspected. They were waiting for him. This wasn't just about taking Catalina. This was a trap. Carlos exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. He needed to rethink his approach. Going in alone meant facing unknown numbers in enemy territory, and while he trusted his training, even the best operators didn't walk blindly into an ambush. He needed an advantage. Backing out the way he came, he moved silently through the hall and out of the ranch house, melting into the night. There was one person in San Felipe who could help him. Someone who knew these lands just as well as he did. Martin. The knock on the door was quiet but firm. Inside, Martin had been nursing a cup of coffee, unable to shake the worry from his mind since Carlos had left. The moment he opened the door, he knew. Carlos had found something. "They have her," Carlos said, stepping inside. His clothes were covered in dirt from crawling through the terrain. "Old ranch past the river. 2 guards down, but there are more inside." Martin swore under his breath. "I was afraid of this." Carlos pulled up a chair, leaning forward. "They know I'm coming." Martin frowned. "Then why are you here?" "Because I need someone watching my back." For a moment, Martin hesitated. He was a cop, not a soldier. Taking on outlaws was one thing, but walking into a full-blown assault was another. Then he looked at Carlos, the unwavering determination in his eyes, the way his fists clenched at the mention of his grandmother. This wasn't just any fight. This was family. Martin set his cup down. "All right, but we do this smart." Carlos smirked. "Wouldn't have it any other way." They moved quickly, retracing Carlos's steps back to the ranch. Martin carried a shotgun, his sidearm holstered at his waist. Carlos had his knife, a suppressed pistol, and a plan. Crouching behind a row of bushes, Carlos pointed at the building. "They're holding Catalina in that room, at least 4 men inside, maybe more. They're expecting me to storm in through the front." Martin nodded. "So we don't." Carlos pulled out a small mirror, angling it to catch the reflection of the second-floor window. A sliver of movement, a shadow passing by. "They have a lookout upstairs," he muttered. "If we go in loud, they'll use her as leverage." Martin sighed. "I don't suppose we can talk our way in." Carlos gave him a dry look. "Not the kind of men who negotiate." Martin tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Then we go in quiet." Carlos nodded. "I'll take the upstairs guard. You cover the exit. No one gets out." Martin exhaled. "Let's do this." Carlos moved like a ghost, slipping through the darkness as he scaled the side of the building. The wooden beams were old, fragile, but he used them to his advantage, finding the quietest path to the upper floor. Peering through the window, he spotted the guard, a wiry man cleaning a rifle, his back turned. Carlos didn't hesitate. He swung inside, swift and silent, wrapping an arm around the man's throat and cutting off his air. The struggle lasted only seconds before the body went limp. Carlos lowered him to the ground and secured his weapon. One less problem. Meanwhile, Martin took position behind the main door, shotgun ready. Carlos signaled from above. "Go." Martin stepped forward, knocking twice. Inside, a voice growled, "Who the hell?" That was the last thing the man said before Martin kicked the door open, the shotgun's butt slamming into his face. Carlos moved fast, descending the stairs as chaos erupted. The rescue had begun. The room exploded into motion. Martin's shotgun blast sent the first outlaw sprawling onto the floor, the second barely having time to react before Carlos was on him, silent, precise. A quick strike to the throat, a twist of the wrist, and the man's gun clattered to the ground. Carlos didn't give him a second chance. A sharp elbow to the temple knocked him out cold. 2 down. More to go. From deeper in the house, a voice shouted, "They're here!" Carlos and Martin pressed against the walls as hurried footsteps pounded toward them. Martin reloaded, his breathing steady but tense. "We need to find Catalina now." Carlos nodded, his mind racing. The room where he had heard her earlier was just down the hall. But before they could move, a shadow flickered in the doorway. A man stepped into view holding a pistol, but it wasn't just any man. Carlos's breath caught. "Ramon?" Martin stiffened beside him. Ramon Hernandez, someone they had both known since childhood. He had grown up in San Felipe, played soccer in the streets with them, sat at Catalina's table more times than Carlos could count, and now he was standing there pointing a gun at them. Carlos's jaw clenched. "You're working for El Toro?" Ramon's grip tightened on his pistol, but his eyes wavered. There was hesitation, uncertainty. "I didn't have a choice," Ramon muttered. "There's always a choice," Carlos shot back. The hallway was thick with tension. Ramon's hand shook slightly, and Carlos saw the inner battle playing out behind his old friend's eyes. "You don't understand," Ramon said. his voice quieter now. El Toro, he's not just here for revenge. He's rebuilding. He wants this town under his control. And if we don't stop him now, Martin cut him off. Then help us. Ramon hesitated, a second too long. A gunshot rang out from behind him. Ramon's body jerked forward as blood bloomed across his chest. Carlos lunged forward, catching him before he collapsed. Behind him, a man stood in the shadows, lowering a smoking gun. One of El Toro's men. Carlos didn't think. He moved. A single, calculated shot. The attacker crumpled before he even knew what had hit him. Carlos turned back to Ramon, lowering him to the ground. Blood pooled beneath him, his breath shallow. Ramon coughed, his fingers clutching Carlos's wrist. I was trying to make it right. Carlos's throat tightened. You still can. Ramon's lips twitched, almost like a smile. Then his grip slackened. His body stilled. A friend lost. A betrayal that had cost him everything. Carlos's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay focused. Ramon had given them something valuable. Information. This wasn't just about Catalina anymore. El Toro had plans for San Felipe. Martin placed a hand on Carlos's shoulder. We can't stop now. Carlos inhaled deeply, pushing down the grief, the anger. He stood, his resolve burning even stronger. No, he said, his voice steady. We end this. With one final glance at Ramon, he turned toward the door at the end of the hall. Catalina was waiting, and El Toro had just made his last mistake. Carlos closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of Ramon's death settle before forcing it aside. There was no time for grief. Catalina was still in danger. Martin reloaded his shotgun with swift precision, his face grim. They know we're here, we need to move now. Carlos scanned the room, assessing their next steps. The hallway was clear for the moment, but that wouldn't last. The gunfire had alerted everyone inside the ranch. More men would be coming. He turned toward Martin. We don't go in blind, we take control. Martin exhaled sharply. Got a plan? Carlos nodded, already moving. We used their own tactics against them. They retreated into a side room, a storage area cluttered with crates and old supplies. Carlos grabbed a small oil lantern and quickly doused the floor with the fuel inside. Martin's eyes widened. You're setting the place on fire. Carlos shook his head. I'm creating a distraction. Smoke will force them into the open, and in the confusion we move. He struck a match and tossed it onto the oil-soaked wood. Instantly, flames licked up the walls, dark smoke curling toward the ceiling. They moved fast. Carlos led the way, slipping through the hallway as the fire spread behind them. Shouts erupted from the other rooms. Panic, confusion, just as he predicted. They reached the end of the hall where a heavy wooden door blocked their path. Catalina was inside. Carlos didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired into the lock. The door burst open. Inside, Catalina sat in a wooden chair, her wrists tied to the armrests. Her face was calm, her eyes sharp as she turned toward them. Took you long enough, she said. Carlos let out a breath, a rare flicker of relief passing through him. He quickly moved forward, cutting her bindings. Are you hurt? Catalina shook her head. Not physically, but we have bigger problems. Carlos exchanged a look with Martin. What do you mean? Catalina's expression darkened. El Toro isn't just after me, he's after San Felipe. Carlos's muscles tensed. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Martin turned toward the door. We need to get out of here, now. Before Carlos could respond, a deep, mocking voice echoed from the hallway. Leaving so soon? Carlos froze. El Toro stood at the doorway, a pistol resting lazily in his hand, his lips twisted into a smirk. Behind him, two more men flanked his sides, rifles in hand. Carlos positioned himself between Catalina and the threat. His mind raced, calculating options. Too many guns, too little cover. El Toro tilted his head. You really thought you could just waltz in here and take her back? Carlos didn't answer. He was already searching for an opening, a weakness, a misstep. El Toro chuckled. You always were too stubborn for your own good. He glanced at Catalina. And you, Doña, you should have just stayed quiet. This town isn't what it used to be. It belongs to me now. Carlos's jaw clenched. Not while I'm breathing. El Toro's smirk widened. That can be arranged. The standoff stretched, the air thick with tension. Then in the distance, a loud crack split through the air. Gunfire, but not from inside the house. Martin's radio crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. Reinforcements incoming. The police are moving in. For the first time, El Toro's smirk faltered. Carlos seized the moment. A single heartbeat of hesitation was all he needed. With lightning speed, he grabbed Catalina and dove behind a crate as gunfire erupted. The final battle had begun. Gunfire erupted like a thunderstorm inside the ranch. Bullets splintered wooden beams, sending debris flying through the air. Carlos pressed Catalina against the floor, shielding her with his body as Martin fired back, his shotgun blasting through the thick smoke. El Toro's men won't hold out for long. Martin shouted over the chaos. The police are closing in. Carlos's mind raced. They couldn't just hold the line. They needed a way out, fast. He spotted a back door, half hidden by old barrels. It was their best chance. Martin, cover us, I'm getting her out. Martin nodded and reloaded. Go! Carlos grabbed Catalina's hand, pulling her to her feet. Despite her age, she moved with surprising agility, her strength fueled by sheer determination. They sprinted toward the back, ducking as bullets tore through the walls. But just as they reached the door, a figure stepped into their path. El Toro. His face was covered in sweat, his pistol raised and steady. But his eyes burned with something deeper than rage. Pride, arrogance, vengeance. You really think you're leaving here alive, Ortiz? His voice was low, venomous. Carlos pushed Catalina behind him. His own pistol was raised, both men locked in a deadly standoff. No hesitation, no fear. El Toro, Carlos said, his voice calm, steady. This ends tonight. El Toro chuckled darkly. That's the first thing you've gotten right all night. Before he could fire, a sudden explosion rocked the building. Martin had thrown a flashbang, its blinding light bursting through the smoke. Carlos moved first. A quick, precise shot. El Toro staggered back, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his shirt. His pistol clattered to the ground. He snarled in pain but didn't go down. Carlos didn't wait. He grabbed Catalina and pushed through the door, emerging into the cool night air. Outside, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights flashed across the trees as police vehicles swarmed the area. Officers stormed the ranch, their shouts filling the night as they surrounded the remaining outlaws. Martin emerged behind them, his shotgun still smoking. Took you long enough, he muttered. Carlos let out a breath, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of it all. Catalina was safe. The town was safe. For now. But as officers dragged out the captured criminals, Carlos's sharp eyes scanned the area. Something was wrong. El Toro was gone. A trail of blood led into the darkness, disappearing into the tree line. He had escaped. Carlos clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Not yet. Catalina touched his arm, her voice gentle but firm. It's enough for tonight, mijijo. Carlos exhaled, nodding. For now. But deep down, he knew El Toro would return. And next time, Carlos would be ready. Carlos didn't think twice. The moment he realized El Toro had escaped, something primal took over. He bolted from the ranch, ignoring the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police, ignoring the pain in his muscles from the night's fight. There was only one goal now. End this. Martin's voice crackled through his radio. Carlos, stand down. We'll get him later. But Carlos knew better. Later wasn't an option. Later meant El Toro could disappear, regroup, and come back stronger. No. It had to be tonight. It had to be now. The blood trail was easy to follow, smeared along the damp earth like a beacon. El Toro was wounded. Slower, desperate. Carlos moved quickly, ducking between trees, his heartbeat steady despite the chase. He had been trained for this, tracking, hunting, closing the distance. San Felipe's dense woods swallowed the sounds of the town behind him, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant rush of the dried-out riverbed ahead. The scent of blood mixed with the damp earth. El Toro was close. Carlos slowed his pace, moving more carefully now. The air was thick, charged with tension. He scanned the area. Low shrubs, fallen logs, shadows shifting in the moonlight. And then, a noise, a faint rustle, a strained breath. Carlos's eyes locked onto the shape of a crumbling cabin near the riverbed. It was old, long abandoned, its wooden walls rotting with time. The perfect place to hide. He approached cautiously, gun raised, his finger steady on the trigger. Every instinct told him this was it. El Toro, he called out, his voice calm but laced with steel. You're out of time. Silence. Then, a chuckle. A low, rasping sound from inside the cabin. "You think this is over, Ortiz?" El Toro's voice echoed from within, rough with pain but still carrying that familiar arrogance. "You have no idea what's coming." Carlos moved closer, his footsteps silent over the dirt. "You lost," he said flatly. Another chuckle. "Did I?" Then came the explosion. Carlos barely had time to react. A deafening blast tore through the cabin, sending a shockwave of heat and force through the air. The world spun. The ground disappeared from beneath his feet as he was thrown backward, crashing hard against the rocky earth. For a moment, everything blurred, ears ringing, vision swimming, the taste of dust in his mouth. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. El Toro, bleeding, battered, but still standing. A hunting knife gleamed in his hand, reflecting the fire still flickering from the blast. His grin was manic, eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and rage. Carlos gritted his teeth and forced himself up, shaking off the pain. His pistol had been knocked from his grip in the explosion, but it didn't matter. This was never going to end with bullets. El Toro flexed his fingers around the knife's handle. "I was hoping for this," he sneered. The two men circled each other, bodies tense, muscles coiled. No more weapons, no more running. This was a fight to the end. Then El Toro struck. A quick, savage slash aimed straight for Carlos's ribs. Carlos dodged, the blade missing him by inches. He countered with a brutal elbow to El Toro's wounded shoulder, drawing a sharp grunt of pain. But the man was strong, too strong. El Toro tackled him, slamming him into a tree. The knife flashed again, slicing across Carlos's arm, drawing blood. Carlos hissed but didn't falter. He wrenched the knife arm away, twisting it toward El Toro's own chest. The struggle was raw, primal, two men fighting with nothing but strength and will. El Toro snarled, shoving Carlos backward, trying to gain the upper hand. But Carlos was faster. A sharp pivot, a powerful strike. Carlos drove his knee into El Toro's gut, then followed with a devastating uppercut to the jaw. Bone cracked, blood sprayed. El Toro stumbled, dazed. But still, he smiled. "You're just like your father," he wheezed. "Weak." Carlos saw red. With a roar, he grabbed El Toro by the collar and slammed him against the tree. "Say that again." El Toro coughed, blood dripping from his mouth. "You don't get it, do you?" He grinned, his teeth stained red. "Kill me, and another will take my place. This fight never ends." Carlos tightened his grip. His knife was in his hand now. One clean strike, he could end it right here. But then Catalina's voice echoed in his mind. "Justice, mijo, not vengeance." Carlos's hand trembled for a brief second. His breathing slowed. No, he had won. He didn't need to kill El Toro to prove it. Instead, he reared back and delivered one final crushing punch to El Toro's temple. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Carlos wiped the blood from his face and looked up. Flashing lights in the distance, sirens wailing. The police were here. Martin was the first to arrive, his shotgun still in hand. He took one look at El Toro's unconscious form and exhaled sharply. Carlos stepped back, nodding toward him. "He's yours." Martin wasted no time, snapping handcuffs onto the outlaw's wrists. El Toro stirred, barely conscious, but his lips curled into a weak smile. As he was dragged to his feet, he muttered, "This isn't over." Carlos didn't respond. He had won this battle, but deep down, he knew El Toro wasn't wrong. Carlos stood motionless for a moment, staring at the battered, bloodied form of El Toro as Martin secured the cuffs around his wrists. His chest heaved from the fight, his arms burned from fresh cuts and his body ached with exhaustion, but his mind remained sharp. The battle was over, or so he thought. El Toro lifted his head, his face bruised and smeared with blood, but the grin on his lips was what made Carlos's stomach twist. "You think this changes anything?" El Toro rasped. His voice was strained, but the arrogance remained. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Carlos didn't respond. He wasn't interested in the last words of a defeated man. But then, a single gunshot cracked through the night. Carlos barely had time to react before Martin staggered, his body jerking as he was thrown to the ground. Carlos's instincts kicked in. He dove for cover, grabbing Martin and dragging him behind a fallen tree. Blood soaked through his friend's uniform. "Damn it!" Martin groaned, clutching his shoulder. Where? Carlos peeked over the cover and saw them. More men, emerging from the trees. Shadows with guns, reinforcements. El Toro's men hadn't given up. Carlos cursed under his breath. He had been so focused on the fight on El Toro that he hadn't accounted for one thing: loyalty. Even in chains, El Toro wasn't alone. "Get down!" Carlos barked as another volley of gunfire shredded through the trees. He gritted his teeth, scanning the terrain. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. And worst of all, they still had Catalina to protect. The moment the shots rang out, Catalina dropped to the ground, pressing herself against the thick roots of an old oak tree. Her pulse was steady, but she knew the danger had shifted. This wasn't over yet. From her vantage point, she could see El Toro's remaining men weaving through the darkness, using the trees as cover. They were trying to flank Carlos and Martin. She had to act. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached down to the ankle holster beneath her dress. Carlos wasn't the only one prepared for war. Her fingers wrapped around the cold steel of a compact pistol, a relic from her late husband, one she had kept for emergencies, and tonight was an emergency. With a deep breath, she aimed at the nearest shadow and pulled the trigger. A sharp cry echoed through the night as one of the outlaws went down, clutching his leg. The others hesitated for a split second, just enough time for Carlos to strike. Carlos didn't hesitate. Catalina's shot had given him the moment he needed. He grabbed Martin's shotgun, aimed into the darkness, and fired. A second attacker crumpled, his weapon falling uselessly to the dirt. Carlos grabbed Martin by the collar. "Can you move?" Martin gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "I'll manage." Carlos nodded. "Then we finish this." He turned his attention back to El Toro, who was still on his knees, his hands bound. The man was laughing. Carlos narrowed his eyes. "What's so funny?" El Toro tilted his head, his eyes gleaming even in the dim moonlight. "You think you're winning." Before Carlos could react, another gunshot exploded through the night, this time from behind him. A sharp, burning pain tore through his side. Carlos staggered, his breath catching as warm blood soaked through his shirt. He spun around, one last outlaw, emerging from the trees, rifle smoking. Before the man could fire again, a final shot rang out. Catalina. The outlaw fell, lifeless. Carlos took a shaky breath, pressing a hand against his wound. The pain was real, but he was still standing, still breathing. That was enough. He turned back to El Toro, stepping forward despite the searing pain. "This is over," he said, his voice raw. For the first time, El Toro's smile faltered. A low rumble filled the air, police sirens. More officers were arriving, their vehicles tearing through the dirt road. Bright lights flooded the trees, illuminating the battleground in stark clarity. Carlos watched as Martin's officers rushed in, securing the remaining outlaws, forcing them onto their knees. El Toro didn't fight this time. He just stared at Carlos, his eyes burning with something unreadable. As two officers hoisted him to his feet, El Toro finally spoke. "You don't understand, Ortiz." His voice was quiet now, almost resigned. "This fight was never just about me. It's bigger than one man." Carlos frowned, his body still tense. "What are you talking about?" El Toro smirked again, but there was something different this time, a quiet promise. "You'll see." Then the officers dragged him toward a police truck, locking him inside. The moment he was gone, the tension finally broke. Carlos exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the night settle onto his shoulders. His body ached, his side burned, and his mind swirled with the implications of El Toro's words. Martin, still clutching his injured shoulder, let out a weak chuckle. "That was insane." Carlos smirked. "Yeah, but we won." He turned toward Catalina, who stood with the poise of a woman who had seen too much but refused to break. She reached out, placing a hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with warmth. "You did good, mijijo." Carlos closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the words settle. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, but deep down he knew this wasn't truly the end. El Toro had left behind a storm brewing in the distance, and when it came, Carlos would be ready. The dust had barely settled. Carlos sat on the back of an ambulance, a medic pressing gauze against the wound on his side. The pain was sharp, but nothing compared to the exhaustion weighing on his body. The fight was over, but the scars would linger. Martin, his arm now wrapped in a sling, lowered himself onto the step beside Carlos with a wince. "How you know," he said with a smirk. "Next time you visit, maybe just bring a bottle of tequila instead of a war zone." Carlos chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'll keep that in mind." A few feet away, Catalina stood tall, watching as the last of El Toro's men were loaded into police trucks. Her face was calm, unreadable. Carlos pushed himself up and walked toward her. "Are you okay?" Catalina turned to him, her eyes filled with something deep, pride. "I am now," she said softly. He nodded. There were no more words needed between them. She had been strong her whole life, and tonight had proven that again. As the police convoy rumbled away, taking El Toro into custody, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. His grandmother must have sensed his unease because she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Let them come," she said. "This family has faced worse." Carlos exhaled, looking out at the horizon. The night had been won. The town was safe, for now. But if the storm returned, Carlos Ortiz would be ready. Like this story? Subscribe for more thrilling, action-packed adventures.